start with a point, and you open up to a triangle with tetrahedron. By the time you get to a hypertetrahedron, you're back to the point again. And that's what this mathematics and some of the drawings up here are hopefully going to help us to see. Okay, continuing further. Let's examine this process a little more closely. Let's look at the process of this opening up from low dimension to high dimension and self-embedding together. There are several different ways we can understand that, and it's a little hard to know where to start, so I guess I have to start from what I found and work backwards to save time. There are 27 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It's a strange number, 3 by 3 by 3. It turns out, this caught my attention when I first heard of it. I think it was Saul Paul Sirach, our physicist friend, who some of you know, who first brought it to my attention, that there are two places where this number 27 shows up in physics, in group theory, and that underlies the physics that they're using now. And the two places are discussed in a paper by Coxeter, a famous mathematician. And they relate to this set of 27 lines, or 27 points. What Coxeter has been able to prove is that if you were to have a sphere in 4 dimensions, it would be defined by the 27 lines that are solutions to the general cubic equation, and that those 27 lines can be mapped identically, 1-to-1, onto 27 points in complex 3-dimensional space on the surface of a 5-dimensional sphere, whatever that means. But we're going to discover is you don't need all these dimensions to do it if you figure out what these dimensions are about, and that's the key. See, we're looking at a system that unfurls. Seed, fruit, new seed, fruit, layer on layer, acorn, oak tree, unfurling from the beginning of time, all the way. And so our system is concentric. This is what I was saying before when I was reading the earlier quote about the idea of concentric effusions of consciousness. The idea, we've all seen it in the Kabbalistic and the mystical text, of these concentric shells that they draw, like an onion, they say the world is like. Concentric shells. Well, if we've got a concentric system, then we can do some tricks. We can reduce a higher dimensional system to a lower dimensional system without losing any of the symmetry. If we reduce it along the radius, we collapse concentrically. Everything shrinks in and we're out, and so the symmetries stay the same. Well, let's do it and see what happens. Let's find out what happens. What I want to present is a new way of displaying imaginary reality, and I want to identify it. In high school, we were taught that one can have a complex plane. We can have an x-axis, and then we can have an y-axis perpendicular to it, an imaginary axis, perpendicular, right angles to the real. That's a convention. It doesn't have to be at right angles. Mathematicians like to draw at right angles because that makes it simple for us to see that the two directions are independent, or orthogonal. But what if we were to say that the imaginary is in our imagination, is inside, and that the real, is the world? And so instead of rotating 90 degrees to get between imaginary and real, let's say we were to go between inside and outside. But of course, if we were to simply make two coordinate systems and they were coincident with each other, then we wouldn't be able to tell anything. They'd be all blurred together. But we know in nature the relationship, the geometric relationship of inside to outside. Because we know in nature, let's see if I can look here someplace, like the little symbol, but you can see it. We know about the Nautilus shell. We know about the golden mean function. We know that as nature unfurls things in golden mean proportions. And the inside is 1 over the golden mean as big as the outside. And it continues to unfurl in golden mean proportion. So if we were to make a plane, instead of making an imaginary plane that has a real axis and an imaginary axis at right angles, what if we were to make the real and the imaginary direction the same, but make the imaginary direction shorter in scale, have it only be 6/10 as big, 1 over the golden mean? Then instead of getting rectangular squares as our surfaces in 3 dimensions, we would get well, actually, not bad, because that's the way they designed the picture. We would get golden mean rectangles as planes. The imaginary one being shortened and the real axis being lengthened. And if we were operating in six-dimensional space, we would have an interpenetration of three of these golden mean planes. And there they are. And each one of these is an imaginary plane. One is an X and IX, Y and IY, Z and IZ, if you want. There are other ways one can arrange it. And what you end up with is, of course, a sphere, an icosahedral sphere. And if you were to look what you can do with it, you can literally put these vortex forms on both faces of the golden mean, the triangles, the golden mean rectangles, showing how they uncurl. And you end up having this icosahedron, representing a complex three-dimensional coordinate system. And then this icosahedron is our equivalent of the five-dimensional sphere. And all we have to figure out then is how we can arrange 27 points evenly on this complex three-dimensional form. Well, figure it out. If you've got 27 points, and they have to be evenly arrayed. Why evenly? Because that's the whole point of the 27. They're evenly arrayed on the sphere. They are fundamental directions on this hyperdimensional, supposedly hyperdimensional sphere. It's not so hyperdimensional anymore because we can see it. If they're evenly arranged, and there are 6 dimensions, then there must be 27 divided by 6 points in each dimension. Very simple. What other choice is there? But 27 doesn't divide by 6. You get 4.5 points per dimension. You can't have a half a point. Even if Descartes slices points in half, we can't cut our seed in half because the plant will die. There's no half points in this system. They're quantum. Quantum of action, actually, in Arthur's terms. So that means that the dimensions must be paired. That means we have to have 9 points in each of 3 planes, surfaces, rather than 4.5 points in each of 6 lines, 6 linear dimensions. Well, that sort of does the trick, because that tells us that the dimensions have to be paired into these planes, and that tells us that what we really have to have, let's see if I can find it, is on each of the planes, we have to have this little vortex shape that's going to have 9 points on it, and we're going to have 3 of them to penetrate each other. And you've seen this from the previous lectures. This I'm calling a Shushan flower, which is what's described in the introduction to the Zohar. And what you can see it comes from is that these are 3 loops here. And what they really are nothing but these 3 loops, but curled up some more. So this is just a curled up version of this. And this form somehow has to have these 27 points arrayed on it. Well, that's exactly what we've done. You see, if you take the form and you put the Hebrew letters on it, and this round Rubik cube is supposed to be this, but something I could write on. The Aleph, the Yud, and the Kuf, the center letters are actually in the middle, in that center point. Then you've got a uniform distribution of the 27 letters in a way that's completely analogous to the way the mathematicians have distributed the 27 points. Now, Kotzeder shows this in 2 different ways. He shows an diagonal projection, which is 3 concentric sets of 9. Very hard to project these hyperdimensional objects. He shows a dodecagonal version, which is 2 rings of 12 and then 3 stacked up in the middle. And in discussion with Solfal Sirag and others, we come to the conclusion that if you have these forms, they also define, in some very fundamental way, Roger Penrose's twister. Now, where do we get the twister from? Here we're dealing with these hyperspherical things, and here we've got this set of nested donuts. Well, again, it's Arthur that pointed out that a solid torus in 3 dimensions is equivalent in many ways to a sphere in 4 dimensions. And so what we've got here is a sphere, a hypersphere, except it doesn't have to be in hyperdimensions if we make 3 levels of donut. Why 3 levels? Because we've got to have an inside, an outside, and an in between. Now we're getting someplace. Because now what we can do is we can come over here and we can look at the Turin, the reflexive Turin, which folks that are here tonight are probably familiar with. Now, I'm not saying these are the same categories. We're dealing with a topological situation here, and we can make any number of sets of categories. But I'm saying that whichever categories we use are going to be isomorphic to this set that Arthur was used. I just pulled it out of the appendix to Reflexive Universe, I believe. Yeah, appendix what? And the whole beauty of this is that, just like on the donut, it's symmetrical. The in and the out parts are reciprocal, and every level is reciprocal, and we've got these 4 levels. In fact, I don't have it here, and I haven't worked it out in detail, but I think we can compare these 4 levels to the 4 letters of the 4-letter name of God. In fact, there's even one that makes you say, because this idea here, this middle one, which I'm calling action together, is actually part of this one, which I'm calling action within and action projection. And we can get that in a minute. So that, in fact, we could really do it with the 4-letter name very compactly. And we could use the 4-letter name to generate our fundamental tetrahedron, and our tetrahedron is going to open up into this hypertetrahedron. And in a sense, it is a hypertetrahedron. Now, not only that, but let's figure out another thing besides the twister, which we now know comes in 3 layers. The twister and the orbifold from superstring theory are not the same objects. They're not the same thing, but they partake of the same topology. And the fundamental object in superstring space is this twister fork, which in complex 3 dimensions has 27 corners to it. Now, the low-order form looks very suspiciously like our alphabet generator. After all, it's a donut with a hole in the middle, a spin axis, and 3 singularities. And I think that you can see the similarity here. This is the hole, and these are the 3 singularities. And if it was in the hyperdimensional space, according to the mathematicians, there would be 27 of these singularities. And they would be in the same form, the same relationship as the 27 points in complex 3 dimensions, which is what they're saying there, or the 27 lines in 4 dimensions, which are intrinsic in the point itself. It's going to get easier, folks, so bear with me a little longer. I know this is going all over the place with numbers, and for the purposes of time, I really can't do all the details. It's more a matter of just showing it. Okay. So what are we to make of this, and what does this tell us? Well, it gives us a hint as to what's going on with the alphabet. Because if we make the presumption that the 27 letters and these 27 lines or 27 points are the same, then we should try to see if there's some underlying logic that holds the 2 in common. Well, we know the logic of the ideal mathematical forms. This is a very, very symmetrical 3 by 3 by 3 system in this hyperdimensional space. What if the alphabet were the same way? What would it look like? Well, it would have 3 levels to it. And that's what we find in the alphabet. And I think that's what we want to go to next. I want to check my notes to make sure I haven't skipped anything. Now, if we can back up and make a language out of all of this, and see if we can figure out what the issue is. Look, to make a language, a universal language, which is what we're trying to make, because that's what the religious tradition claim, that's what the sacred alphabet is supposed to be for. It has to be common to all consciousness. It has to be very elegant. And it has to do what language does. What does language do? What does language do? What does language do? Right. You point at something. You name something. You have to. If I were walking around and I pointed to this thing, and I wanted to tell you about this thing, I could call you into the room and I could point to that thing again. But if you weren't in the room and I didn't want to do that, I could make a drawing of it maybe. Or I could make a noise. How am I supposed to know what noise to make? Well, here's the theory. This is what we're going to go with. This is a non-linguistic theory. This is a non-drift theory. We're not referring to what the linguists are doing. This is a different level of understanding of life. When I take my arm, my hand, and I point at something, my hand does that pointing. because there is a map on my motor cortex for my hand that tells my hand how to point. And that motor cortex map is not just a photograph of my hand in some particular position, it's a dynamic model. It tells my hand how to move. It's got at least a beginning and an end to it, and a middle too, probably. And so that dynamic model can't be just a three-dimensional model. It has to have dynamics in it. It has to have change in it. That is what a mathematician would call a hyperdimensional model. It would have to have some additional information. Well, if it's a hyperdimensional model, if our conceptual space on our motor cortex, which directs the motion of our hand, is hyperdimensional, say 4, 5, 6, or 7 dimensions, then this geometry holds. And the natural parts of that map, no matter how my neurons are wired, no matter what kind of brain I have, no matter what my biology is, if I am directing this kind of motion, I must be making use of these 27 directions in that map. That's the lowest way that I can specify the whole map. And therefore, on my motor cortex, there is some kind of a map laid out in these 27 directions. And let's say I want to make a sound that corresponds to my pointing. Well, what's the most obvious thing to do? Is that the sound? The most obvious thing to do is to co-opt the same map as I use to move my hand and slide it across my motor cortex from my hand to a region in my motor cortex from my hand that serves another purpose. Language is controlled by a sub-region of the motor cortex for the hand. Broca's region and the other language control regions are there. And if I try to take the same map and just slide it across some kind of neuron transfer thing, and then use the same set of map of coordination to articulate the muscles that make my sound rather than move my arm, I'm going to end up making a sound. But who knows if it's the right sound? I mean, there's no obvious hardwiring connection. This is a conceptual map. But I hear the sound I make. And that comes back into my sensory cortex through my ear. And I'm saying that the map on my motor cortex that moves my hand, and the map on my motor cortex that makes the sound, and the map on my sensory cortex that hears the sound, are all hyperdimensional maps. And the feedback loop that connects all of this is also a dynamic map. And all of these have 27 parts. Or the 22-part version. I don't want to get confused with it. In other words, it's back to what Critchlow is saying. The unique unity and union are one. All three cortex maps have to be the same for that sound to have meant what that hand did. And so what I'm saying may be the case is that these letters, as we're going to see, are not initially the letters of ordinary language, as the linguistic theorists would have you believe. Later they became that. They were co-opted for ordinary speech. But they are instead the natural pieces of the envelope of the reflexive process that any self-aware creature must use to form any language. That it is necessary in its lowest order that this projective process have these 27 pieces, that they have the same logical structure that Coxeter and the group theoretic physicists point out, and that's, no matter what we really do, we can always simplify what we've done to this 27-element system. It covers the whole gamut. Now, the only way to find out if this makes any sense is to try to use it. And so we're going to try to use it. But before we try to use it and go to this matrix of meaning for the letters of the alphabet, we have to somehow recognize what this generator for the letter shapes has to do with this map on our cortex. Well, what is this shape?
It's a what?
I said at the beginning I was going to call it naked recursion. That's another fancy word for a kind of self-embedded reflexive structure. That basically every module of this self-referential process has to partake of this. And so what could this thing be? Well, if you had a sphere in 3 dimensions, it would have 3 diameters that would be perpendicular, right angles to each other, Cartesian cross. If you had a sphere in 4 dimensions, there would be an additional diameter perpendicular to the other 3, but we couldn't see it. It's the one that we correlate with dynamics, with change in 3 dimensions. It's the one that relates inside to outside in free space. In fact, going to 4 dimensions, you could actually take right-handed things and convert it to left-handed things by rotating through hyperspace, theoretically. So it's this inside-out direction. This is the missing diameter of the hypersphere projected back into 3 dimensions. It doesn't have to be a hypersphere. What we're calling, the mathematicians are calling a 4-dimensional, a 3-sphere in 4 space, is really nothing but the dynamics of an ordinary sphere in 3 dimensions. And this form that connects the inside to the outside of a fruit, a dimpled sphere, an idealized fruit, this is that diameter. And so, if I can see all of these possible orientations, all of these letters, if they correlate to these 27 directions, then this alphabet gives me a way to point in hyperspace, or in conceptual space, to all the possibilities. Well, I just said it, to point. You see, this is hand. This is not only the flame of consciousness, this is our model of inside projected outside. What I want to do something in the universe with my will, this is the instrument of my will in the world, is my hand. I could use my foot, I could use my nose, but I mostly use my hand. If I wanted to make an alphabet that would be equally good for the world of physics, the real world, and would be good for meditation. Why meditation? Well, let's step back again and say, what's this alphabet for? Let's say you find yourself off in the desert 3,000-4,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, biblical times. And fell off a camel, hit myself in the head. Wandering around, there was this funny mushroom next to the rock there, and I tasted it. I pricked my finger and got poisoned and had a terrible experience. I just didn't eat for a few days. I wandered in the desert for a long time. I ended up, one way or another, having a mystical experience, a transcendental experience. And it's an integrative experience. It's a healing experience. Modern psychotherapists report that when you have these peak experiences, these transcendental experiences, you come back a more integrated person. Your inside and your outside are more attuned with each other. But this is an ineffable experience. You can't describe it in words by definition. No matter how good you are, there isn't any language you could use to describe this. So how can you pass on this teaching, this ability, this experience? Well, obviously, if you fell off a camel and hit yourself in the head, it's not the way you want to reproduce the experiment. It's not really very reproducible. But if you had a means of re-experiencing this, a meditation, a sequence of exercises, breathing exercises, dancing, yoga, mudras and asanas, whatever it might be. Different traditions use different means, different people use different. And if you could somehow specify the experience so someone else could retrace your path, then they would have the same experience. And so if somehow there were a means of specifying a meditation internally, that would be a much better way of reproducing the experience than simply writing down, I had this wonderful peak experience which I can't describe. Because then the next person who could retrace your path exactly would have supposedly an equivalent, a related experience. And so we want an alphabet that's going to work inside too. Not only does it tell us what direction to point in the world, but it also has to be visualizable in our mind's eye. And that's what makes this so beautiful. There are 2 teachings about the source of the alphabet. One of them is that the letters come from fire or flame. And the other, in Hebrew, is that these letter shapes, and these are the formal shapes, all are made up of the letter Yud. This small little letter, they're all composed of little pieces of Yud. That's a nice teaching. And it's obviously true in terms of calligraphy. But Yud also means hand. And the one thing that every human being can automatically do, survival necessity, is visualize their own hand. You close your eyes. Try it. Close your eyes and point towards the ceiling. Hold your hand any way you want. You will be able to see in your imagination, in your mind's eye, where your hand is, where your fingers are, where your palm is. And so, if you put the hand in your hand, feel it against your skin, and can immediately visualize the letters. What is more natural as a source of an alphabet than to take from the hand the letters in the same way as the speech is taken from the motor cortex from the hand in the brain? And how is it forgotten that the letters came from a hand? We wrote it down. It says it comes from Yud. Except people thought it meant small Yud instead of the hand. So now we have the physical metaphor, the physical expression of outside of our inside, being used for the purpose of connecting outside and inside and outside. And this is the first important finding, is that what we're really looking at here, what's really going on, is that this naked recursion, this self-embedment, is our hand. This is how we express our inside in the outside world. This is our way of embedding ourselves in reality, is our hand. All right. Now, I think I want to go directly towards the most difficult and controversial part now of this presentation. And we'll come back with questions and comments to some of these other ideas. I think there'll probably be lots of questions. Because what I want to do now, present something that's unbelievable. It's not that others haven't said it, it's that they haven't said it in a way that's credible. I certainly never believed it before. The claim that the Hebrew letters are the actual elements of creation and are natural elements and were originally a universal language, knowledge of which was lost at Babel and things like that. Who would believe that? Many people have said it, of course. In fact, it's even been demonstrated to some extent. There is a computer program that you can buy based on the Arabic alphabet that translates between languages called Reware by a company called MITI out of, I think, Washington, D.C. There's some local people that was spoken to. They base their computer system on the second surah of the Quran, and they don't know why it works. So it does seem to work, but I think this is the underlying reason why it works. And what I want to do is I want to go through the alphabet letter by letter. Now, most of you should have alphabet charts. And what I want to do is do these charts and this chart here. And I think rather than my continuing to give you all this theory, I should put these definitions of the letters on the table and let you take them all home and try to use them. So let's see if we can do it. Here is a fundamental process, fundamental self-organization. And I'm saying that this 7-step process is the trait, and that it connects between unity and wholeness, between the seed and the fruit, with new seed inside, between a point sphere and a sphere point,